Bienvenue à tous. Thank you all for attending our grand round. Rabbi Joshua Lazary, Rabbi David Boydana, it is an honor to have you here with us today to discuss the case of Mr. Leib Goldstein. I am Dr. Rafi Hodder, a cardiologist, and this is my colleague, Dr. Miriam Boydana, a geriatrician.
We are Leib's treating and consulting physician. Unfortunately, our colleagues that were consulted, Dr. Nemeth, Dr. Shaheen, and Dr. Aziza, are unable to be present today.
Our patient, Leib Goldstein, a 65-year-old male, suffered a myocardial infarction 6 days ago. He's currently unconscious, on a respirator, and has an IVP inserted into his groin. We must address Leib's pressing cardiac issue, and we would like to discuss 3 potential treatment options that we have proposed to his daughter, Shayna. The 3 options are as follows: a bypass surgery, a medicinal treatment, and leaving the IVP in place. Now, being in a Jewish hospital, we need the help of Talmidei Chachamim such as yourselves to help provide guidance to Shayna that is in most accordance with Jewish law.
Well, from a halachic standpoint, life is viewed with the utmost importance. We learn from Pikuach Nefesh, Lochei Shabbat, that saving a person's life even overrides some of the 10 Commandments. We also learn from Masechet Yomah that we may do so for a brief period of time. This obligation is referred to as Chayesha.
I have to say, Rabbi, you bring up very interesting points. However, shouldn't we include a mathematical concept? Here's what I propose. In order to determine which treatment maximizes his Pikuach Nefesh and Chayesha, let us estimate Leib's expected life for each treatment option. After all, math never lies.
Pardon my interruption, Dr. Hodder, but we must take into consideration the fact that Leib is in the 3rd stage of Alzheimer's, and his lifespan will therefore most likely not exceed a year. So, even if the cardiac surgery would work flawlessly, and if he would not succumb to any complications, he would still be likely to die shortly after from complications of Alzheimer's.
That's all. So by incorporating the presence of his late-stage Alzheimer's disease into our calculations, we would obtain an estimated lifespan of 5.9 months for the surgical option, 3.5 months for the medicinal treatment, and only 1 month if we leave the IVP in place. Now, these mathematical estimates were determined by incorporating all potential known outcomes associated with each treatment option, as well as their corresponding risks. So, from the standpoint of maximizing Pikuach Nefesh and Chayesha, it is clear that the best halachic option is the surgical one, because it provides the greatest life expectancy.
I like the way you think, Dr. Hodder, but Jewish law may not be as simple as a mathematical calculation. The Tosfot commentary on Avodah Zarah 27b teaches us that the basis of Chayesha is to act in the best interest of the patient.
Too much risk couldn't be considered to be in the patient's best interest. Tell me, Rabbi, at what point does a medical procedure become too risky to be permissible?
Well, the majority of Chachamim follow an opinion called Safek HaShakul. In the Mishnat Chachamim, we learn that any medical procedure that has a risk of immediate death greater than 50% is forbidden. That is, even if the procedure might completely heal the patient.
Ah, ça change absolument tout. From a medical perspective, the surgery is qualified as high risk. However, the risk of immediate death from the procedure is at most 30%, a risk that is halachically permissible.
Oy vey, Mir. I just remembered Rabbi Moshe Feinstein forbids risking Chayesha for a life extension that is less than a year. As you previously mentioned, Dr. Boydana, it is highly unlikely that the surgical option will extend Leib's life more than a year. So, as much as I hate to say this, the surgical option might just be halachically untenable.
With all due respect, Rabbi, Moshe Feinstein's opinion is not relevant to our situation. It only applies in procedures that carry a risk of immediate death greater than 50%. Well, in our case, we have a risk of only 30%. And therefore, we must base ourselves on Rabbi, who permits these low-risk surgeries, despite there being a life extension of less than a year.
Heureusement. Although we cannot disregard the ruling of a Gadol Hador such as Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, his ruling simply does not pertain to our case.
Another thing we must take into consideration is the concept of mitayafa, an honorable death. Doctor, will the surgical option be giving Leib a chance to die mitayafa?
Absolument. The surgery is the only option that gives Leib a realistic chance of returning home, or he'd be able to recognize the familiar environment when experiencing moments of lucidity. All other options would confine Leib to a hospital bed where he might have his wrists attached like a prisoner due to his elevated state of agitation. This is truly an undignified and tragic way to end one's life, and it represents the complete the opposite of a mitayafa, which can only be achieved in the surgical option.
Now wait a minute. Why would leaving the IPP in place even be considered an option if Yaraha? There seems to be no advantage whatsoever.
Doctor, let us not rush to conclusions. You learn in Masechet Shevamot about a principle called Shev Ve'al Taseh. The principle at hand is to do nothing at all, which is quite similar to leaving the IPP in place.
Well, Doctor, Rabbi, I'm not so sure. I believe, again, this principle is being taken out of context. For the principle of Shev Ve'al Taseh to apply, the patient must be a gosses. The Rambam rules that a gosses is someone on the brink of death. Someone will die, certainly, within the next 72 hours. Will he?
He won't. As his treating physician, I can say with utmost certainty that Leib will live for longer than 3 days.
Well, if that's the case, then the principle of Shev Ve'al Taseh does not apply, because Leib isn't gosses.
But does that mean that leaving the IPP in place is completely forbidden?
Well, it sure looks like it. Rav Wiener's commentary on Sefer Hasidim teaches us that any medical procedures that are potentially harmful and that have not been tested are strictly forbidden. So, since this option is almost never done in medicine, it's not halakhically permissible.
Alright, so now that we've ruled out the do-nothing option, we are now left with 2 viable halakhic options to consider.
But the preferred option is the surgery, as it is the one most likely to treat the underlying cardiac illness, have him dismissed from the hospital, and maximize his lifespan.
True, but what about the patient's suffering? Choshen Mishpat teaches us that we do not extend the patient's life if we are only extending his suffering.
Wait a second, guys. Dr. Ben Sazon just reminded me of another type of bypass operation that would minimize the suffering felt by Leib. It's called mixed cabbage.
What? I didn't know cabbage had healing properties.
No, mixed cabbage, as in minimally invasive cardiac surgery, coronary artery bypass grafting. Mixed cabbage. This intervention is minimally invasive in that it does not involve the breaking of the rib, and thus drastically reduces recovery time from several weeks to a few days. Hence, our recommendation to Shana would be to proceed with the mixed cabbage intervention.
Our case highlights essential medical and halakhic issues. Although we strongly prefer and recommend the surgical option to Shana, we cannot reject the medicinal option as being halakhically forbidden should the family choose it. We thank you all for joining us today. Merci. The floor is now open for questions.
Thank you very much for that lovely presentation. So you introduced this new mixed cabbage alternative, which seems to be an alternative to the option A, a different kind of procedure. Could you explain better how that serves as a better option vis-a-vis the problems that were posed to the regular procedure? And I'm referring to a couple of things. So we seem to struggle a little bit with the percentage rate and the risk factor of survival versus imminent death, immediate death. The other issue you raised was the pain, the suffering issue, and how well could that be contained. What are the types of improvements that this new kind of surgery would improve over the other surgery?
Okay, so to answer this question, the mixed cabbage operation is a minimally invasive surgery, which means that the surgery is actually done through 3 smaller incisions rather than the typical sternotomy incision. So we have 2 incisions of 1 inch, and 1 incision of 2 inches. And the advantages of this surgery is that since the incisions are smaller, the risk of wound infection is lower, and the recovery time is also drastically shortened because we are not breaking any ribs or any breast bones. And he would be dismissed from the hospital a lot faster. He would be in a lot less pain, and there would be a lower risk of infection.
And the success rate probability for this is?
It's higher, since based on the information provided to us in the case, Leib does not fit any of the contraindications of this surgery.
Okay.
So every minimally invasive surgery also runs the risk of having to do a regular sternotomy because you never know what might happen. So the risks, I'm assuming in an elderly patient who just had a heart attack, late-stage Alzheimer's might be higher depending on his other medical background, which we didn't really have. So there still is a risk even in doing mixed cabbage that we may end up doing open heart surgery. So when you do your statistics, I'm assuming you'll be able to take that into consideration as well. I'm interested in two topics that you mentioned. The first one was mitayafa, so rural mitayafa, and what role does that play? How does that balance pikuach nefesh? And how do we judge what a mitayafa is? I'm looking for parameters. How do you decide what that is? I'll start that.
So a mitayafa is an honorable death. So we can see that with the surgery, it's the only option that would give him a realistic chance of returning home. So he would be at home, spending his last days at home, surrounded by his loved ones, and his last moments of lucidity would be cherished. And also we see that in the other options, such as the medicinal option or the other ones, he would have to extend his stay at the hospital, which would then increase the risk of nosocomial infections, which would then increase the risk of having several deliriums, which would lead to the doctors attaching his wrist to his bed like a prisoner, and this is really the complete opposite of a mitayafa, an honorable death.
So to just follow, so where's the source for the mitayafa? Where are you getting that from? I don't need a page number, just an idea. Okay, so we'll leave that as a B. And when you're mentioning the mitayafa, so we may disagree very much what mitayafa is. The way you're describing it, so this man has a 70% chance of coming home, not today, not tomorrow, he still has to recover from his mixed cabbage. So he will still have the risk of nosocomial infection, having also had surgery, so the risk then goes up. He may still need to be tied to his bed because he still can be agitated after the surgery, and there's only a 70% chance of him coming home. Somebody may argue that in the third medicinal option, so he may only have a couple of days, but he has 100% of being lucid for, let's make it up 3 days, as opposed to a 70% chance of coming home in a couple of weeks. So how do you determine, who's going to determine what I mean? And somebody might say, you know what, I had a good life. For me, a mitayafa, I might disagree with you. I say mitayafa for me, an honorable death. I don't want to be, surgery is not for me. Don't invade my body, don't touch, I'm not interested. How do we determine what's honorable for somebody else? What are the parameters?
So, very basically, if we're looking at it from the standpoint of moments of lucidity. Moments of lucidity are granted, they're fairly rare, they're not as frequent as they were earlier in the earlier stages of Alzheimer's. So the probability of moments of lucidity occurring over the 3-day span in the medical option are not as probable as if we extend his life for the potential of him living up to a year. So he'll have more moments of lucidity. As for the statement about having his hands tied down like a prisoner at home, that's not going to happen, because the reason why Alzheimer's patients, for example, during his moments of lucidity, he'll wake up and not know what he is. And in the medicinal option, he'll have all sorts of tubes coming into him, and that's really it's not a nice thing to do to a human being. It's kind of a little bit of a degradation of the tzedek Elokim that is in all of us humans. So if he's at home, Shana will be able to take care of him. She'll be able to calm him down. She's been doing this for, well, God knows how long. She quit her job. She gave up everything to take care of her father. So it's not like she's just some new person coming into this, oh, I don't know how to deal with my father when he gets anxious. We can assume that she is experiencing dealing with these outbursts. Probably more than the doctor, because the average resident, for example, how would he know how to deal with a 65-year-old Alzheimer's patient, the first time he's ever seen this in his life, and he's going all crazy, and they have to climb down to the bed because, well, there's all sorts of tubes in him, and there's people who he doesn't know, and masks and gloves. It's a very scary thing for an Alzheimer's patient, and it's not really a good way to live in his final moments.
So I'll let your colleague, the geriatrician, figure out how to calm him down just at the last moment. Is there something ironic in deciding to extend his life using a principle of choosing honorable death? Just something to think about. You're arguing to extend the man's life by doing the surgery, because that's, you mentioned, will give him the longest amount of life. And the argument for that is that we're choosing for an honorable death.
Well, because we're looking at quality as well as quantity. We're looking to maximize both. We're looking to maximize, make him live the longest. And of course, if we're going to make him live long in horrible conditions, what's the use? We want to make him live in good conditions, long life, and have as enjoyable a life as he can. And die peacefully too.
given that you've done a lot of extensive research with doctors and the medical situation, did anybody consider hospice as leading to a dignified death with minimum invasion of the body and comfort within the medical procedures? Well, the application of morphine, for example, to lower anxiety and to prolong the comfort of the patient.
So that would be sort of palliative care type of treatment.
Right.
And you know what? Our role as a Beit Din is not to command. The Beit Din doesn't have that power anymore in North America, given the times. So our role is just to recommend Shayna what we think is the best, as far as extending his life, as far as giving him the best possible life, and as far as what's most in accordance with halakha. So if Shayna chooses, so Rav Avraham Israel Reisner teaches us, and this is in the he teaches us that dangerous surgeries that are potentially deadly are always discretionary, and that human precaution and specific individual discernment is what should decide whether or not we want to go through with this procedure or not.
Right.
So it's up to Shayna whether she wants to decide to do this. She can choose the morphine if she believes it's in the best interest of her
Right.
father. But we recommend